So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today at the 3 o'clock session, the psychological science of forgiveness. This is part 1. What is it? Why is it important? And when should it be offered to others? So today's presenter, I'm Kristen Sweeter from the New York Council on Problem Gambling, and you'll notice that my name begins with staff. So I'll be on the entire time with you. In case you have any technology issues or questions, you can put them in the chat box. If you need assistance or have questions for the presenter, put them in the chat box as well, and we'll address them towards the end of the presentation. The Q&A will also be done at the end. So if you could hold all of your questions till the end of the session, that would be great. So today's presenter is Dr. Michael WOHL. He is a professor and graduate chair in the Department of Psychology at Carleton University. He's also the director of the Betterment Labs, and members of the lab focus their research attention on, among other things, factors that predict disordered gambling. I'm so sorry, I'm checking at admit all as we go here. Disordered gambling, facilitators of responsible gambling, as well as barriers to change, as well as means to overcome barriers to behavioral change, forgiveness,
chair,
and nostalgia for life lived. If everyone could just take a moment before we get started, I'm trying to be very conscious of the time. If you could please just mute, that would be great. So without further ado, Dr. WOHL.
It's supposed to be 26 weeks for unemployment.
Hi all. Yeah, I think some people are still unmuted. So if you would be so kind to mute yourself so that others can hear.
Yeah. Until September.
Yeah, if the host, if you could just mute all, that would be great.
So sure? I got unemployment renewed for another 26 weeks.
Okay, I think now everybody can hear me, correct? Thumbs up? Yeah, awesome. So thank you, NYCPG, for inviting me to speak with you today. And also, thank all of the attendees for logging on this afternoon or for or whatever time zone, time of day it might happen to be in your neck of the woods. The joy of, I guess, the one benefit of the pandemic is that we've got really used to these webinars and can Zoom people in from everywhere, including Canada, which is where I'm at right now in Ottawa. Just so you know, every once in a while, I'm going to be peeking over to the side because I have 2 screens set up here, and I have all of, well, at least some of the faces off to my right and the chat box. So I'm going to try to keep an eye there. In the session today, I encourage you to ground the information that I'm presenting in personal experience or a clinical experience if you happen to be a treatment provider. Doing so is going to help make what I talk about today a bit more tangible. But listen, this event could bring up some raw emotion. The problem is that when you mute all, I get muted as well. So I'm going to try to keep an eye on that as well. Okay, I'm not going to be asking you to share specifics of your life situation or clinical experience. This is not the venue to do that. But I will be asking you to think about the hurts that you've experienced or your clients have experienced as we walk through here. If you're finding this a little bit too much, please feel free to walk away from the computer. And I also encourage you to speak to a healthcare professional. With that in place, I never want to be a talking head. I know that at the top, they said, hold your questions till the end. But in this session, I encourage you to either put a question in the chat box or raise your virtual hand or unmute yourself and ask a question. I see no point in waiting until the end of the hour, and then that point has been lost and people can't remember what maybe what I was talking about. But of course, you're going to remember everything that I was talking about, right? Yes, of course. So what are we going to be talking about in this session? Okay, well, it's split into two parts. I'm going to try to present all of the information. So what is forgiveness, the benefits of forgiveness, the facilitators of forgiveness, all within the first hour, but I'm not going to rush or impede any kind of healthy conversation. I'm going to assume that most people who want to attend part one are going to attend part two, and there's going to be few, if any, people who just attend part two and don't necessarily attend part one. But in part two, we're going to be focusing on self-forgiveness, the good, the bad, and the ugly of self-forgiveness and addiction, some caveats there, and what are some ways that you can perhaps be more forgiving or teach people to be more forgiving. I'll also say that I have, in this presentation, I try really, really hard to not present statistics. Okay, there are very few data slides. When there are stats, I'll walk you through them, but don't worry. I just present some stats here and there for the stats nerds that might be in the crowd that want to see the p-value. But if you don't understand what a p-value is, don't worry. Just listen to me talking and I'll walk you through the results. So with all of that said, let's jump right in. What I'd like you to do is to take a moment and think about a significant hurt that you have experienced, or perhaps one that your client has experienced. And I want you to think about who was involved and did that influence the hurt that was experienced? Who was the transgressor? I want you to also think about the events that transpired.
Because doing it virtually, I suck.
I remind everybody to please mute yourself. Okay, I want you to think about what happened. Is the client, or are you if you're thinking about a transgression that are hurt that occurred to you, a hurt, are you sure that it happened the way that you think that it happened? Okay, and why are you sure that it occurred in that particular way? Okay, what were the emotions that were experienced when it happened? And what are your emotions about that hurt right now? Okay, these are all important issues that we will be covering throughout the next hour and 2 hours. And so my challenge for you today is to think about that event within the context of the information that I'm going to be presenting to you today. Okay, I want you to try to answer some of these questions as it pertains to the event. Was forgiveness granted? And why was it granted? Can that relationship truly return to its pre-transgression state? Okay. I want you to think about whether or not an apology was offered and whether or not that influenced the forgiveness process, and whether or not what role can play in terms of behavior change. Now, I'm not necessarily going to be answering each one of these questions, but they are things that I want you to ponder as I progress. To help kickstart that pondering, let's start with the nature of coexistence. We spend our entire lives bumping up against others with our exteriors, never truly realizing the rich inner life of those around us, their so-called secret world. We assume we know what others want from us. But listen, often we don't. Often we act in ways that others don't like. Often we hurt them unintentionally or intentionally. And of course, other people do that to us as well. Think about how many times over the course of your life you've heard somebody say something like, I didn't know that's how you felt, or I had a completely different understanding of the situation, or I'm sorry. When such a statement are uttered, how did you respond? Did you get your back up? Did you hear these words and did they help thaw the tensions? Did you forgive? Forgiveness, after all, does help mend interpersonal relationships. That is, and always has been, a fundamental human activity, right? Forgiveness. The human animal is a social animal. It is one of the reasons why the physical distancing measures during this pandemic has been so hard. Given we are a social animal without means to heal the wounds from transgressions, there is no way that we would have the civilization that we have today. I really love this quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It isn't easy, as we all know, to ask for forgiveness. It's also not easy to forgive. But we are people who know that when someone cannot be forgiven, there is no future. Some powerful words from a very thoughtful man. But of course, Tutu was coming at forgiveness from a theological perspective grounded in Christianity. What we will be discussing today is the psychological science of forgiveness. In psychology, we deal with perceptions of reality. I always tell my students, my undergraduate students, my graduate students, that in psychology, reality is often beside the point. We study the causes and consequences of people's perceptions of reality. We study how people think, how people feel, why they may think and feel in certain ways, and whether those thoughts and feelings can be changed for the purpose of health and well-being. You should know that forgiveness was not a well-studied phenomenon in psychology until about the 1990s. This is because, in part, forgiveness was seen as the domain of religion, and psychologists have traditionally tried to tended to steer clear of theology. But of course, although forgiveness is discussed at length in theology, it is not a concept restricted to the domain of religion. In many ways, it is a secular issue. To be clear, today we are not going to be discussing forgiveness from a theological perspective. We will be taking a wholly psychological perspective. And what does that mean? It means we are trying to understand people's understanding of forgiveness, its causes and its consequences for individuals. Psychologists use the scientific method to ask questions, to construct studies of various kinds, and we use data to look for answers. And the first step in this process is to operationally define the construct under investigation. So, what is forgiveness and what is it not? We've been talking for the last little while about forgiveness. Perhaps you have a working definition. What I'm going to be doing is talking to you in the next couple of minutes about how psychologists tend to understand forgiveness. And perhaps it's easier to start with what forgiveness is not. Okay, it is not pardoning, because pardoning means washing the event away. It is not condoning, because condoning means that you're saying that that it was okay to commit the act. Okay, it's not excusing, because that means that transgressor had a good reason for committing the transgression. And it's not forgetting, okay? Because forgetting implies a memory loss. And lastly, it's not denying, because denying means that there's a reluctance to see the event as harmful. So what is this beast, okay? What is forgiveness? Well, there have been a number of working definitions from a psychological perspective. The first really that appeared in the psychological literature was from Enright, who said that it was a decrease in resentment towards the transgressor and an increase in love, okay, towards the transgressor. I've always had a little bit of issue with that. I don't think you need to love the transgressor to forgive. Perhaps the gold standard definition is from Mike McCullough, who argued that forgiveness is related to various motivations. So 3 related motivations: a decrease in the motivation to avoid the transgressor, and a decrease in the motivation to seek revenge, and an increase in benevolence towards the transgressor. I've had many arguments with Mike about this. I don't believe that you necessarily have to have a decrease in avoidance to forgive. I think back to when I was a little bit younger and I had a friend who committed a transgression against me. And, at one point I was just like, listen, I forgave him for his transgressions, but I don't want to hang with the dude anymore, right? We happen to still have a lot of mutual friends, and I'm more than happy to say hello to him and talk to him like everything's okay and everything is okay between us. I hold no ill will. I just don't want to hang with the dude anymore, okay? So my working definition is more of a simplified definition, okay? And that is just simply no longer holding negative thoughts or feelings towards the other person for the past wrong, okay? And that's the definition that I'm going to be working with you today. So the next question that I have for you is, how rampant is this phenomenon? Put differently, how often do people forgive? And there was a large-scale poll done by the Gallup folk back in 1991, so quite a number of years ago, but I think the data still hold. And they asked people, what do you do when you feel that someone has deliberately done something wrong to you? Okay. And what we see here is that about half of the population, okay, say that they tried to forgive. Did you think that that would be higher? Why or why not, right? What we can see here is that an equal number, okay, an equal portion of the population are trying to overlook it. And we see that around 20% of people just don't let go of that negative feeling, right? So, but listen, forgiveness is hard. When somebody does something bad to you, it can be really difficult. When somebody harms you, it can be really difficult to let go. In fact, what we can see here is perhaps, slightly the more common response here is to not engage in the forgiveness, the forgiveness process. So I submit to you now, so should we forgive? Okay. That's not necessarily an easy question to answer. Should we forgive? At the end of the day, it's a personal decision. I'm here to tell all of you, some 250 people in the room, I'm here to tell you the pros and cons of forgiveness. and how one can move towards forgiveness, if that is your desire. So let's first look at why you may want to forgive. First, okay, hurts are emotionally loaded. Think about hurt that can be caused by addiction. Imagine you were the partner of a disordered gambler. In such situations, perhaps your partner is spending all of their time at the casino and not with you. Perhaps the college money that you set aside for your kids is now gone. Okay, perhaps your retirement money as well. And how did that make you feel? My guess is rather crummy, to say the least. My guess is that you can feel it in your heart and feel it in your bones. And I'll show you quite literally. The negative emotions that stem from hurts can do a lot of bodily damage. Okay, emotional pain and physical pain can do similar bodily damage. In fact, the body can't tell the difference. My friend, Dr. Ethan Cross at the University of Michigan, who recently published a book that I urge all of you to get called Chatter, and that is how the voice inside of our heads can do both good and bad, and how to lead that inner voice towards doing more healthy thoughts. Ask people who had recently experienced an unwanted breakup. Okay, so these are people who experienced an unwanted breakup to come into the laboratory. And he put them in an MRI to see their brain functioning. Now, what did he do when they were in the MRI? Well, he inflicted a bit of pain with a prick to the finger and then watched the brain react, okay? And then he showed them a picture of the person who just broke up with them, okay? The same regions of the brain lit up. We also see a similar cortisol release. That is the stress hormone. Cortisol is the stress hormone, which is okay in the short term, but bad chronically. So if your body is cortisol, if you don't know what cortisol is, think about cortisone cream. It's a synthetic cortisol. Cortisol is released in the bloodstream to sort of prepare our body for damage. But if you're chronically stressed, then that system burns itself out. Okay, think about if you've experienced long periods of stress, you may find, and then you get a cut, it takes longer to heal. Okay, that's because your body has burned out what's called the HPA axis, which releases cortisol. So an unforgiving response means holding on to that pain, that anger, which can eventually burn out the cortisol, the court response, making it harder for the body to respond. Okay, the body can't differentiate physical pain from emotional pain. Okay, an alternative, of course, is to forgive. Okay, this is a quote from Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said, "Under very trying conditions, I have had again and again to forgive others and also myself." Okay. Bill Wilson here addresses addiction, recovery, and forgiveness in this statement. Here, Wilson frames forgiveness as a desired asset, a way to cope under difficult circumstances. A beneficial outcome of this step, okay, of this work, is the recovery process. He portrays forgiveness as an accompaniment to sustainable recovery. Now, researchers have studied the association between forgiveness and a range of outcomes, including addiction and its resolution. And one pathway to addiction is the desire to escape negative life situations. Perhaps a significant interpersonal trauma they are trying to cope with. And forgiveness might be a critical step here to let go of those negative feelings so that they don't feel that they have to escape. And why might forgiveness work? Because forgiveness can neutralize the negative emotions like anger, which are known triggers for addictive behavior. And in fact, so beneficial is forgiveness that therapies have been developed that specifically target the forgiveness process to increase the forgiveness process. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, these forgiveness therapies, but I just very briefly to tell you what happens in these therapies. In the first model developed by Everett, remember the guy who defined forgiveness, the first definition of forgiveness, he developed a therapy that encompasses 20 units and 4 phases, which include cognitive, affective, and behavioral elements. In the first phase, the uncovering phase, this involves identification of psychological defenses, recognition and expression of anger about the offense, and acknowledgement and evaluation of psychological harms caused by the offense. In the second decision phase, participants explore the meaning of forgiveness, consider the possibility of forgiveness as a response, followed by a commitment to forgive. And the third phase entails cognitive reframing. That is seeing the offense in a new light, developing empathy and compassion for the offender, and accepting the pain experienced. Participants here are encouraged to find meaning in the suffering experienced and recognize their own mistakes, which may require forgiveness. Okay. We also have Everett Worthington's REACH model, where he asks participants, clients, to recall the hurt, there's the R, to develop empathy for those who hurt them, to see forgiveness as an altruistic gift, and then make a commitment to forgive, and try to hold on to forgiveness even in difficult times. And there was a recent systematic review of these therapies showing that they indeed do facilitate the forgiveness process and have positive impacts on health and well-being. Let me be clear here that forgiveness also matters for addiction recovery. Okay, so getting sober won't put an end to the pain and trauma that one has experienced. There needs to be a mechanism to let go of the negative feelings associated with the traumas that people have experienced. And forgiveness is one possible route to that end. Okay. In addition to this, it's not unusual to see people who are living with addictions relapse after rehab. Why? Because they think sobriety is the solution to their addiction, when in fact forgiveness and letting go are critical components. So if they haven't forgiven and let go, that there is likely a greater possibility of relapse. Why does forgiveness and forgiveness therapy works? Well, in short, because it helps facilitate this letting go process. Okay, letting go of the baggage, so to speak, which can not only help people mentally, but also can help people physically. And let me show you. Here's a host of outcomes from the academic literature that we see are associated with the forgiveness process. So people who forgive, they have better blood pressure than those who do not. healthier muscle tension, better immune function, improved cardiovascular function, improved muscular functioning, improved nervous system functioning, less psychological pain, reduced stress, increases in self-confidence, self-compassion, quality of life, as well as hope. Now let's take a closer look at this, okay? I'm going to show you perhaps the first graph of the day. Again, let me walk you through it so you're not overwhelmed by it. Okay, so let me hammer home this point to you and give you some data. Participants in a study were asked to think of someone who they felt had hurt them significantly. They were then asked to imagine an unforgiving reaction, so either rehearsing the hurt in their mind or harboring grudges in their mind, or forgiving reactions, that is feelings of empathy, or they were instructed to have a forgiving posture. And what we can see here, okay, this is the start. I don't know if you can see my pointer here. So this is the start of the imagery. And what we have here is change scores. So this is an increase in heart rate, okay, when they started the imagery session. And what we can see here is right off the bat, those who were instructed to rehearse hurt or grudges, their heart rate immediately shot up. Whereas those who were asked to, who were instructed with empathy and forgiveness didn't shoot up as much. Okay. Also, what we see is that people's heart rate increased much more sharply and took longer to return to normal when their thoughts were more unforgiving. That is rehearsing hurt and grudges as opposed to empathy and forgiveness. Okay. Let's take a deep breath now. I've been downloading a bunch of information to you over the last half an hour. What we're going to be turning our attention to next is how do people come to forgive? Okay. And here, I want to tell you a little bit of a story about me and how I came to forgiveness. I'll talk a little bit about it later on. I want to tell you a little story about when I was in graduate school at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, where this was one of the first forays that I had into the forgiveness literature. The notion of forgiveness fascinated me, and why at the time there wasn't more research on the topic in psychology. And Dr. Don Kuiken at the University of Alberta, I remember this vividly, comes into my office and said, "Michael, you really seem to have this experimental psychology down pat. You're a great experimentalist, you know, assigning people to conditions, analyzing that data. Now let me teach you real psychology and getting your hands dirty with qualitative data." He said, "Listen, what we need to do to really understand the psychology of forgiveness is go to the proverbial horse's mouth, ask people to tell us about a time in which they forgave, right? And then let's read those narratives and see what we can find." Okay. So we asked people to tell us the time in which they forgave, why they forgave, and the consequences of their forgiveness. Now, despite using first-year undergraduate psychology students in this, I was quite surprised to see the number of transgressions that were related to addictive behavior. Let's put aside that infidelity runs rampant in the first-year population. We also saw a number of narratives about people who were dealing with addiction in their family, and in particular, gambling. Okay, we had one participant note that their dad had spent their tuition money at the casino, at the local casino. Now, what did we find? We found 3 unique routes to forgiveness that had unique consequences. The first path was more of what we're calling an interpersonal route to forgiveness. Okay, this is where they had an open and honest discussion about the issue, the hurt, with the person that they hurt. They expressed to us, they let them, the transgressor, know how they felt. The second path seemed to be related to what we call a more intrapersonal or intrapsychic forgiveness. And that is where they didn't necessarily say that they spoke to the person that hurt them. They said that forgiveness was an expression of their moral fortitude. And they realized that everybody was fallible. The third path, people said things like, forgiveness helped me move on, okay? But they expressed that that they decided to forgive, but they couldn't forget, okay, the transgression. Now, what was fascinating about this is that there were very different outcomes for the relationship, depending on what path people took, okay? People who took that first path, what we tended to find is that the relationship strengthened after forgiveness was granted. Remember, this first route is the interpersonal, where they discuss the transgression with the transgressor. What we saw in path 2 is that the relationship seemed to return to its pre-transgression state. Okay, it didn't improve, it didn't deteriorate. Okay, it just kind of kept moving forward the way that it was before. In the third path, the relationship deteriorated. In fact, we heard from many of the participants saying that they are no longer in the relationship with that person, or they no longer speak to that person, even though they say that they forgave that person. Now, why is path 1 such a good path to take? Well, we argue that when you speak to the transgressor and have an open and honest discussion about the issue, it sets the limits and boundaries of that relationship, right? We often have limits and boundaries to a relationship, but they're not made explicit. You might think that the other person knows how you feel, but they don't. Remember what I talked to you about at the beginning, at the top of the hour here. We tend to assume people understand our rich inner life, but often people don't. So when you talk to the transgressor, you let them know how you feel. You can say, listen, if we are to stay in this relationship, you cannot do X, Y, and Z. And that can lead to a strengthening of the relationship. All right, let's now talk about some other, now, let me take a pause. Are there any questions so far? I know that there have been some, okay, Jessica raised her hand. So Jessica, would you mind unmuting yourself and ask the question?
Yeah, sorry, I typed in the chat box. So for path 3, was it that they forgive and forget, or forgive and don't forget?
Okay. So path 3, thank you for asking for that clarification. They said that they would forgive, but they would not forget.
Thank you.
Okay. So what we assume here is that now we don't want to call this pseudo forgiveness, because remember, we asked for a time in which people said that they forgave. So we don't want to read into it too much that it was not a real forgiveness. What we think here is that when you're saying that I'm not forgetting, is that you're ruminating. You're probably still ruminating a little bit about the event. And every time you see that individual, it reminds you of the situation and you act differently. And you might actually be undermining the relationship, okay? Because you're always on guard. You might forgive that particular situation, but you see that person slightly differently. And you might be unwittingly undermining the relationship. I hope that answers the question, Jessica. Are there any other questions before I jump into individual differences?
I have not a question. If it's not too much problems, you know, the slide before other reasons to let go.
Yep.
Could you show that quickly? I just wanted to get a picture of it. Is that okay?
Yeah, of course. This one?
Yes, sir. Yes, that one. Yes.
Okay. Let me know when the picture's been
yes,
taken.
I got it. Thank you, man. Thank you very much.
No worries.
I also have a question, if you may.
Sure.
The why for the introphysic route for forgiveness, path 2.
Oh, yes.
Why that outcome?
So I think it's more related to, so when you say that it's an expression of your moral fortitude, you understand everybody's fallible. So listen, you forgive and the relationship is repaired, but it's not strengthening, right? You just kind of go back to the way that it was. So I'm not saying that necessarily that path 2 is bad. What I'm saying is that probably the better path to take, if I'm to make a value judgment here, is path 1, because you are setting the limits and boundaries of the relationship. You are making what is typically implicit, so or what is unsaid. We tend to assume that our partners, our parents, our friends, our kids understand the limits and boundaries that we have on our relationships, but often people don't. You might think people know, but they don't know. So when you talk to them, you have an open and honest conversation. You can set the limits and boundaries of that relationship, and that is what strengthens it. Now what is unsaid becomes said, the implicit becomes explicit. Okay. So
yes, thank you.
All right. So for the sake of time, let's move forward a little bit. I'm not going to spend too much time on personality factors, but we do know that there are individual differences, that some people are just more forgiving than others. In the literature, there is what's called trait forgiveness. So that is, again, that there is some people just have a tendency to be more forgiving than others. And in fact, that is one of the reasons why I started studying this, right? Research is me search. I found that I tended to be more forgiving than perhaps I should be at times, and I wanted to know why. We also know that people who are who tend to be agreeable, that they tend to be more forgiving, okay? Because they tend to have a more optimistic view of human nature. Right? People who are high in neuroticism, they tend to be low in forgiveness. Okay. Now, I'm not a personality psychologist. I'm a trained social psychologist and health psychologist. So I'm always interested in the social situations that can facilitate forgiveness. How can you move forgiveness? And I've spent a lot of research time on social factors that facilitate forgiveness. So one of my first studies was on time. So we've all heard I'm sure many of us, if not all of us, have heard the phrase, time heals all wounds. And in fact, it does, right? But I was also, and why does time tend to heal wounds? Because as time separates us from the transgression, the hurt of the transgression, that pain tends to dull over time. And so we can start looking at things in a newer light. One of the first studies that I did, though, is I also manipulate. Time is very malleable, okay? So people's perceptions of time. So for some of us, breakfast seems like it happened like moments ago, right? But we can also think like, wow, breakfast happened a really long time ago. And there's a really neat way that you can actually manipulate people to think that an event happened subjectively close in time, or far away in time. And what we found is that when we could subjectively push the transgression further away in time, so make people feel that the transgression happened a long time ago, that seemed to facilitate the forgiveness process. Okay. Now I see that there's still a hand up. Was there, Harry, I see that your hand was up.
Yes, thank you. At one time, we had a member of our board was a former parole commissioner. And one time during a conversation, he told me, he goes, if you ever speak to any of these guys, he goes, tell them the worst thing they could ever do is I'd like to ask the family for forgiveness. Because he said, all it does is re-traumatize them and make him sound like he's such a great guy. Now, whether that was true or not as a psychiatric thing, that's what he based his, if those words were uttered, you got 2 more years.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I don't know the intricacies of that, so I of that particular situation, but based on that snippet, I'd go back to that, people often we tend to project how other people would think and feel instead of asking people how they think and feel, right? And forgiveness truly can be a route to recovery for all parties, okay? The research shows time and time again. Now, one of the problems, and perhaps for the sake of time, I've got about 15 minutes left in this first session. I'm going to skip one of the slides and maybe go back to it because I want to answer, Harry, your question, because I think one of the key issues, we'll go back to that if there's time, is this, and that is apologies. Okay, the number one facilitator of the forgiveness process is an apology. Okay, the negative effects of interpersonal harms can often be muted when an apology is offered. But not all apologies are created equal. And when just because somebody apologizes doesn't mean that forgiveness has to follow. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people feel that when there's an apology, they feel forced to forgive. Okay. And so my colleagues and I created what we call the staircase model of apology and reconciliation. Okay. Harry, I see that I just got a message saying your hand was up again. Is that because you wanted to, or it's just, okay. So let me walk through a staircase model, and maybe, Harry, this will help address some of your question and some of the concerns that were expressed around I think the seeking forgiveness and perhaps the apology process. Okay. Number one is an acceptance of responsibility. So we are going to be working up the ladder to the offering of the apology. What needs to be put in place for an apology to be effective, to facilitate the forgiveness process? Number one is an acceptance of responsibility. You must hold yourself culpable. So here we're talking about the transgressor.
We'll look into
how does the transgressor and the transgressor's actions help facilitate the forgiveness process, right? Leading to an apology. First of all, the transgressor must accept responsibility, okay? If the person who's been transgressed against does not believe that the transgressor is actually accepting responsibility, okay, then forgiveness isn't going to occur, and you're going to drop off the staircase. Okay, think about, for those who, sorry, I'm going to make a Taylor Swift reference. Say her song "Look What You Made Me Do." Okay, if you're not going to apologize if you think that your transgressions are really the fault of the other person. Look what you made me do. You're the reason why I committed the transgression, right? Next, in the staircase model is that should the transgressor accept responsibility, then you have to set the records of history, okay? Often the victim and the transgressor don't see eye to eye about what happened, okay? The victim may say something like, I want you to write down what you did, okay? Now, the perpetrator might not like that, right? And in fact, that might undermine the whole apology forgiveness process. But what's being said here really is we need to have a discussion. Remember the path to forgiveness? We need to have a discussion so we get on the same page about what happened. And once you get onto the same page, then maybe you discuss reparations. Okay. And what does that look like? And I'll say that, sometimes what we find is that the transgressor wants to maybe provide like monetary compensation, and the victim doesn't want that, right? Because the money is seen as kind of blood money, right? What am I supposed to do with this, right? Do I buy a car with this? And then every time I drive a car, I'm going to think about that transgression. Whereas victims often want to have something permanent, okay, as a sign that it's sort of like a statue or something like that. Whereas the transgressor doesn't want that because they don't want the permanent reminder. So the transgressor and the victim must come to some sort of mutual understanding before an apology can be given. Now, an apology can often, the apology in and of itself, okay, can be problematic, right? Sometimes you'll hear the transgressor say something like, well, it's time to turn the page, right, on this event. I'm sorry, let's turn the page, right? Well, it's not the transgressor's place to say it's now time to turn the page, right? Even the offer of the apology is ripe with problems, how they say sorry, when they say sorry, okay? So if a transgressor apologizes too quickly, I have some data on this. I'm just getting a note that we have to end in about 3 or 4 minutes. So, and then log back in. Okay, so if this interests you, and I see some positive, thank you. Somebody said, I love this presentation, great. Feel free to come to part 2 and we'll continue this discussion, okay? But I'll say that apologies can happen too soon, right? So if you hurt somebody and then say, I apologize, the victim often sees that as a knee-jerk reaction, that the transgressor didn't truly understand. They're not thinking through the harm, and it can be too late, right? That if, say, the transgressor apologizes months or years down the road, then that might also be seen as a transgression in and of itself, okay? And also, the apology isn't the end game. And this is also where things can go awry, because often the victim sees the apology as the start of the reconciliation process, okay? You've apologized, now the real work starts, okay? Whereas the perpetrator, the transgressor, often sees the apology as the end game. I've apologized, it's time to move on. Okay, and there we can see a disjoint as well. Okay, I think in the last couple of minutes here that we have, I'll mention this because I think that it's really important knowledge, and it happens to be the last slide. So if you'll bear with me, now, before I leave the social factors, I feel it's a must to bring in the notion of mindset, okay? It's just such a powerful tool, not only for forgiveness, but a number of things. So according to Carol Dweck at Stanford University, people vary in how they think about behavior and behavior change, okay? On one end of the spectrum, People believe that behavior is malleable, okay? That is, that it can be changed with some effort. These people are referred to as incremental theorists. On the other end of the spectrum, people believe that behavior is fixed, that it cannot be changed even with effort. These people are referred to as entity theorists. Now, Dweck's original research was done in the context of intelligence. She has a boatload of research and researchers who have followed up since, showing that it's better for a child's motivation and well-being to frame intelligence as malleable, okay? That is rather than fixed. So you don't want to tell a kid that she or he is smart or dumb. You want to highlight intelligence as something that can grow with effort. Researchers have expanded this notion of mindset well beyond intelligence. People have fixed or malleable mindsets about a number of different life domains, like the belief that behavior is fixed or malleable. Okay, do you think that you can teach an old dog new tricks? We argue that because these ingrained differences in these ingrained differences in people's mindset, we can expect to see some variability in who forgives. And what do you think? Do you think people who have an incremental mindset are more likely to forgive, or people who have an entity mindset are more likely to forgive? Well, due to time, I'll give you the answer. The answer is that incremental theorists, okay, are initially less forgiving than entity theorists. And that difference can be explained because incremental theorists have a stronger tendency to think that transgressors are responsible for causing the harmful event, okay? But they think that the harm doer, okay, has the ability to change, okay? So incremental theorists believe that the behavior is malleable and thus can change. As such, they are more likely to stay in a relationship if the transgressor expresses a desire to change their behavior and take the necessary steps to do so. Does that make sense? So they're initially more hurt and unforgiving, but if the transgressor apologizes, takes the necessary steps to change, they express a desire to change, then the incremental theorist is going to be more likely to go down the path of forgiveness, okay? Which we'll see can also influence the transgressor's ability to engage in that behavior change. Okay, well, where forgiveness and self-forgiveness and behavior change are interdependent.